So welcome everyone to a special lecture for the Dalai Lama Center for Compassion. We have speaking today Dr. Benedikt Göcke, who's an associate or assistant professor rather at the University of Bochum. He's recently published a book on the Absolute with Palgrave, Frontiers in the Philosophy of Religion. He edited a book a couple of years ago entitled After Physicalism with Notre University Press. And he's currently engaged in research in the area of providence and randomness. But today he's going to talk us about the ethical implications of Krause's Panentheism.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. The topic of the paper is Karl Friedrich Krause's Panentheism and its ethical implications. Panentheism is an often discussed alternative to classical theism, and almost any discussion of panentheism starts by way of acknowledging Karl Friedrich Krause as the person who coined the term. However, apart from this tribute, Krause's own panentheism is almost completely unknown. In what follows, I firstly present a brief overview of Krause's life and correct some misconceptions of his work before I turn to the core ideas of Krause's own panentheistic system of philosophy. In brief, Krause elaborates a scientific holism that is anchored in intellectual intuition of the absolute as the one principle of being and recognition. The task of philosophical speculation, consequently, is twofold. The analytic ascending part of philosophy proceeds by way of transcendental reflection, and according to Krause, enables us to obtain intellectual intuition. The synthetic descending part of philosophy starts by way of showing that science as a whole is an explication of the original union of the absolute as apprehended in intellectual intuition. Once this is achieved, Krause argues that the emerging philosophy of science is most adequately referred to as panentheism, since everything is what it is in and through the absolute, while the absolute itself is not reducible to anything in particular. I end by showing how to relate Krause's panentheism to recent philosophical discussions and how Krause's panentheism is able to justify a particular ethics of compassion for every creature, alive or not. Introduction. Karl Friedrich Krause is a forgotten figure in the course of modern philosophy. He was born on May 6, 1781 in Eisenberg in Thuringia in Germany. Krause himself was of a sickly nature in his infancy. Not only did he suffer from permanent headaches, but also fell ill with smallpox at the age of 5, which was accompanied by epileptic attacks. At the age of 8, he suffered from measles. He was of a rather small stature and remained so during his childhood. He spent his first school years in Eisenberg before he moved to the convent school in Dondorf in 1792. In spite of his illness, Krause retained the time in school in good memory. I quote, "How many benefits do we have thanks to the few so-called monastic schools? Alas, I too owe my education partially to such a mild establishment. There I found a refugee, a kingdom of God for such a poor, sick, tormented child as I was." End of quote. In 1801, he obtained a doctorate in philosophy with a work on the inexcusability of white lies. Shortly thereafter, he passed the theological examination and fell in love with Amalie Concordia Fuchs. They never separated and begot 14 children during the 30 years of their marriage. Since, as a private teacher, Krause had no regular income, his early marriage and the number of his offspring forced him to rely financially on his father, who worked as a Protestant preacher. Krause never managed to escape this financial dependency. During his whole life, he has been unable to obtain a permanent position at a German university, partly due to his own stubbornness and partly due to external circumstances. A year later, in 1802, he obtained the German habilitation in Jena with the work De Philosophiae et Mathesios Notione et Erarum Intima Conjunctione. From 1802 to 1804, he delivered lectures on logic, natural law, and pure mathematics. In 1805, he announced lectures in Jena for the last time. However, he left the city 2 weeks before the beginning of term. Despite the insistent entreaty of his students, his patrons, and his father, he could not be moved to resume to work as a private lecturer at the University of Jena. The personal reasons for this can be reconstructed with caution. First of all, the decreasing number of students at the university, of whom Krause could not expect sufficient income. Then the resentment of influential professors, like Schelling. Third, a strong desire for solitude and tranquility in order to perfect his academic education. Finally, the fear of being decried by his opponents and thus deprived of any possibility of appointment at other universities. We cannot know what has been the strongest of these reasons for Krause. Fact is that Krause has seen no future for himself and his academic career in Jena, although he has been a successful lecturer who was popular with the students. He went to Dresden, where he began a lifelong entanglement with Freemasonry. However, after initial success as a member of the Brotherhood, Krause found himself dismissed from membership. The reason for this seems to be that his book Die drei ältesten Kunsturkunden der Freimaurerbrüderschaft, which he intended as a blueprint for the reform of Freemasonry by way of making it more universally available, was unacceptable to the traditionalist wing of Freemasonry. He had his membership revoked in 1810, because of which Krause felt persecuted by the Masons ever after. In November 1813, because he was unable to find a tenured position at the university, Krause left Dresden for Berlin. He taught successfully there for some time, but once again failed to obtain a tenured position. Disappointed, he moved back to Dresden in 1815 in order to pursue various works in progress. Among these were works concerning mathematics, natural law, metaphysics, education, and speculative theology. From 1815 to 1818, he lived in the same house as Arthur Schopenhauer. However, during the second stay in Dresden, he could not settle, and he moved to Göttingen in 1823. Here he met with the same obstructions that had already plagued him in Jena, Dresden, and Berlin. Although quite popular for a time, Krause was quickly dissatisfied with the number of students, his lack of a tenured position, and the intellectual climate at the university. Krause delivers the following judgment. When I came here to Göttingen, I hoped for a sphere of pure intellect and a brisk susceptibility of the young man that was not yet destroyed by the calumnies and persecutions of the so-called brothers and philosophers. But I did not know the local group of teachers and was not aware of the ignorance of such unscientific artisanal scholars that already had caused corruption, brutality, and insensitivity in most of the students here, thus making it impossible for me to reach more than a very few of the people studying here. It is understandable that he remembered melancholically the beginning of his career in Jena. I quote, "If I had not ceased teaching at the university in 1804, or had just continued to write, I would not be in a position that Fries or Hegel could look down on." Apart from the bad luck he had finding a job at the university, another problem emerged. Krause was suspected to be part of the Göttinger student rebellion in January 1831. Although he was innocent, the accusation seemed reasonable. On the one hand, some of his students were in fact involved, while on the other he came into a considerable amount of money at this time. It was said that this came from the Revolutionary Committee in Paris. In fact, the money was part of an inheritance. In spite of his innocence, however, the police forced Krause to leave Göttingen, and he went to Munich, where he neither had a job nor any particular prospects by means of which to sustain his wife and their 14 children. The last shock of his life was the fact that he was prompted by a police decree to leave Munich. He was accused of morally spoiling the students who joined him. However, since he was supported by, amongst others, influential figures such as Franz von Baader, the king lifted the expulsion order. However, nevertheless, he was not allowed to teach at the university. Schelling, a lifelong nemesis of Krause, seems to have prevented this. On September 27, 1832, Karl Christian Friedrich Krause died destitute, lonely, and without fulfilling his life's aim, to lead humanity through his system of philosophy to a better future. His funeral took place, as a colleague of Krause records, in the smallest circle of family and close friends. I quote, "5 of his students and a young scholar carried him out. His coffin was followed, except from the clergy and a single friend, only by his crying children. Thus the man went to his last rest so desolate. He, who loved all of mankind in his heart until it broke, and whose love for all people was not likely to be matched. End of quote. Karl Christian Friedrich Krause left an astonishing oeuvre consisting of 256 different books and articles covering almost every branch of philosophy, the humanities and the sciences. Unfortunately, most of his books are not yet edited and apart from two sources not yet translated into English. However, through his pupil Julian Sor del Rio, he gained some popularity in Spain and Latin America, where his philosophy goes by the name of Krausismo, and where he is sometimes said to be the greatest of the German idealists. This slight fame notwithstanding, the only tribute paid to him in recent Anglo-Saxon and German philosophy is that he is known as the one who coined the term Panentheism. On the whole, knowledge of Krause is minimal, often false, and invariably incomplete. For instance, it is said that his philosophy is mystical and spiritualistic, that he was an obscure figure who expressed himself in an artificial and often unfathomable vocabulary which included monstrous neologisms which are untranslatable into German, let alone English. It is said that he was under the influence of Schelling and a student of Hegel. While it is simply false that Krause was a student of Hegel and that he was under the influence of Schelling in any way worth mentioning, it is grossly inadequate to characterize his philosophy as mystical and obscure. It is true that Krause's philosophy is demanding due to the style of his writing and the neologisms he introduced, but anyone who actually makes the effort to engage with the system will quickly find that it is in no way obscure, let alone mystical, or for that matter untranslatable. Moreover, they will discover that the system is largely coherent. Second, transcendental philosophy and intellectual intuition of God. Krause's aim was to establish a system of science as a whole. In this system, every science is related and interconnected with every other science in such a way that the universe of discourse of every particular science can be understood as dealing, respectively, with a different feature of a single principle of recognition, whereas this principle, quote, is that which makes the beginning and is the first ground of everything, end of quote. Since Krause assumed that science as a whole is an image of being, thereby presupposing at least a correspondence, if not an identity theory of truth, it follows that this principle of recognition at the same time has to be the principle of being. As Krause says, science has unity of its principle only if the principle of recognition is nothing over and above the principle of being. End of quote. Since this principle is the first ground of everything, it follows that it is truly unbounded and infinite, and thus the only proper object of science. Furthermore, since Krause also calls the one principle of being and recognition God, or Wesen, or the Absolute, it can be said that in Krause's system, God is the one and only proper object of science as a whole. Complete recognition of God, therefore, logically entails recognition of each and every truth to be found in the sciences. Krause calls the recognition of the one principle of science the intellectual intuition of God. In order for science to be possible for us in principle, we therefore have to be able to obtain at least partial intellectual intuition of God as the one principle of being and recognition. The demand that we only have to recognize some of the features of the Absolute is reasonable, since we are finite beings. We could never fully grasp all the features of this infinite principle. Consequently, science is a never-ending task of humanity as such. Furthermore, since only an absolutely certain and immediate recognition of the principle of science can avoid scientific relativism, according to which science might just be a consistent but false system of putative recognitions, the intellectual intuition of God as the one principle of science has to be immediate and absolutely certain itself. That is, Krause argues that the principle, quote, has to be recognized as that which in itself and through itself is immediately certain, end of quote. Although this intuition has to be immediate and absolutely certain, not everyone is able to comprehend it without further philosophical aid. Krause provides this aid in the analytic ascending part of science. The task of the analytic ascending part of science is to show that transcendental reflections on the condition of the human subject lead to the recognition of the one principle of being and recognition. Krause is aware that he can only pave the way to obtaining intellectual intuition. Quote, "Everyone has to find the intuition in himself. We cannot force it from the outside to happen inside." End of quote. The analytic ascending method of philosophy excludes any form of educational formation. A human being may only use those recognitions that are available directly, immediately, and with certain insight. Metaphysical, logical, historical, and epistemological assumptions and speculations that cannot be seen to be valid and true by every single person must not be taken into account. I quote, "The analytic part cannot be based on all sorts of hypotheses and desultory reasoning. Rather, it gathers the first certain recognitions of the mind. And all conditions, all hypotheses, all unauthorized musings are restrained by the analytical way. There's not even talk about what we feel, think, wish, hope, but only about what we know for sure." End of quote. The advantage of the analytic ascending method is obvious. In his quest for the recognition of God, it enables Krause to assume a position that requires no philosophical background knowledge, and thus allows every person, independent of their education and social position, to find insight into the nature of God by self-reflection and reasonable reenactment. Elitistic approaches, which withhold the knowledge of God from anybody but a small circle of philosophically or theologically learned professors, was an abomination for Krause. Instead, the analytical ascending method of philosophy includes, quote, "the scattered spirits of all, each in its own state, raw and educated people, children and adults, and old male and female spirits. Because this method takes people purely as people on the ground in which all differences of the pre-scientific mind and spirit root, germinate, and grow up." End of quote. Krause draws two important conclusions in the analytic ascending part of science that, according to him, prepare us to obtain the absolutely certain and immediate intellectual intuition of God as the one infinite principle of science. Firstly, he argues that there is a set of basic transcendental categories according to which our recognition is structured. Secondly, he argues that the transcendental logic of recognition entails that any recognition is triadic, consisting of a recognizing subject, a recognized object, and a principle uniting the object and the subject. In regards to the first point, Krause rejects the Kantian categories of understanding as arbitrarily chosen and suggests his own categories. According to Krause, there are material and formal categories of understanding. Very roughly, material categories concern the fundamental properties of the objects of our understanding, whereas formal categories concern the fundamental mode of givenness of these objects. The three basic material categories of understanding, according to Krause, are unity, wholeness, and itselfness, while the three basic formal categories are positivity, directedness, and composedness. Since our understanding of any object is also an understanding of this object as a unity of its properties, Krause introduces the category of original unity, which denotes the union of the material and formal categories of any entity. Everything we recognize, Krause argues, is subsumed under these categories. Furthermore, since the principle of recognition is at the same time the principle of being, the transcendental categories of understanding are at once the transcendent categories of things in themselves. Krause illustrates the alleged adequacy of his categories with the example of a grain of sand. I think about a grain of sand. Although my recognition of this entity might be imperfect, I cannot fail to think of it as possessing original unity. I cannot fail to think of it as possessing itselfness and wholeness. and also the unity of its selfness and wholeness. Furthermore, I distinguish the grain of sand as a whole from its parts, its internal constitution. I cannot fail to think of the grain of sand as something positive which is directed upon itself in its act of being and thereby composes itself completely. End of quote. Since we conceive of every object of the mind as subsumed under these categories, one might wonder whether we also think about the principle of being and recognition as subsumed under them. The answer is yes and no. Yes, insofar as Krause argues that we also think about the one principle in terms of the mentioned categories. No, insofar as the one principle is the ultimate ground of everything and therefore cannot be subsumed under these categories. This would entail that there is another, more basic principle which explains that the former falls under these categories, which is impossible as regards the ultimate principle of science. Instead, the one principle of recognition and being is the original unity of these categories, and as such is indistinguishable from their union. That is to say, the one principle is the most fundamental original unity of the distinct formal and material categories of understanding. It is not subsumed under the categories of wholeness, positivity, and its selfness, but it is itself the original unity of them. The highest principle is wholeness and positivity and its selfness all at once, and therefore can be addressed as the highest idea of reason, according to which every recognition and everything in itself is structured. As regards the second conclusion of the analytic ascending part of science, in order to understand how to obtain the intellectual intuition of God, that is, in order to understand that it is absolutely certain and immediately clear that there is this principle, we have to reflect on the finitude of the I itself and on the structure of recognition as such. According to Krause, quote, recognition is a relation of an essential union of the recognized as an independent entity with the recognizing as an independent entity. It therefore follows that if we assert a recognition to be true, we then have to assert too that the recognized and the recognizing are related in such a way that the object of the recognition in this recognition is present to the recognizing subject according to its essence. End of quote. Recognition is thus not a binary relation between the cognizing subject and the cognized object, but rather a triadic relation amongst the recognizing subject, the recognized object, and a principle which, respecting their mutual independence, unites the subject and the object into recognition. While the I as a principle of every recognition concerning itself is the principle of itself, it follows that if the I has knowledge of something which is not within the I, that is, of something which is outside of it, it cannot be the uniting principle of the resulting recognition itself. As Krause says, quote, we have to assume that corresponding to each and every thought which concerns what is not within the I, there is a uniting element outside of the I. End of quote. This principle outside of the I is what unites the I as a recognizing subject with the object as a recognized object. For instance, if I recognize a table as a finite object outside of myself, then a principle is needed in and through which the table as the recognized object and I myself as the recognizing subject are united into recognition. Because as the relator of this recognition, neither the I nor the table can be the uniting principle, the principle itself has to be thought of as distinct from myself and the table. Given that the one principle of being and recognition, that is, God, is available as a thought that transcends the I, we have to assume that its true recognition is possible only if there is a uniting principle such that it unites the I as the recognizing subject with the one infinite principle as the recognized object. The crucial step in Krause's argument is the already mentioned condition that the recognition of the one infinite principle of science has to be immediate. It must not be thought of as mediated via a separate principle. This would contradict the immediacy of the respective recognition, as well as the infinity of the one principle. It follows that although there has to be a uniting principle for a successful intellectual intuition of the one infinite principle, this principle cannot be anything but the one infinite principle itself. As Krause says, quote, "By way of thinking the thought God, we are at once conscious that this thought, even as our thought, cannot be caused and justified by us ourselves, nor by any other finite being. Instead, the possibility and actuality of this very thought can only be thought of as justified and caused by its content, that is, through God itself." End of quote. Since we already know that we have the thought of the one infinite principle of being and recognition in ourselves, we reach the intellectual intuition of God when we understand that God itself, as the one infinite principle of being and recognition, justifies and causes us to possess immediate certain knowledge of himself. That is to say, the intellectual intuition of God is obtained by whomever it is that intuits God as the one infinite principle of science, or, quote, as the one unconditioned, independent, identical, and whole one essence. End of quote. Science and Panentheism. Once we have obtained intellectual intuition of God as the one infinite principle of being and recognition, the task of the analytic ascending part of science is finished, and we can turn to the synthetic descending part that starts with the intellectual intuition and deduces the whole system of science out of this intuition. In what follows, I can only mention two important conclusions of the synthetic descending part of science. Firstly, according to Krause, the whole of science can be understood as a making explicit of the categorical original unity of the one principle of being and recognition. Secondly, the relation between God and the world has to be thought of analogously to the relation between a whole and its parts, in such a way that the whole as a whole is more than its parts, while the parts are nothing external to the whole. This, Krause argues, inevitably leads to the thesis of panentheism. As regards science as a whole, Krause argues that the universe of discourse of every science is precisely determined by a respective corresponding material or formal category that is part of the original unity of the Absolute. The interdisciplinary relations between different sciences, consequently, mirror intra-categorical relations between the different categories of the Absolute in such a way that science as a whole can be understood to be an infinite making explicit of the original unity of the Absolute. In other words, Krause's philosophy of science is a scientific holism, the truth of which is justified through the intellectual intuition of God. For instance, there is a science which Krause calls mathematics, and which we would refer to as set theory or mereology. The task of mathematics is to specify further the concept of a whole in relation to its parts. Mathematics, thus, is a science of a particular feature of the Absolute, because the original unity of the Absolute is also wholeness itself. Furthermore, since, for example, the original unity of the Absolute is also positivity, there is another science, the universe of discourse of which is determined by the category of positivity. It deals with what it means to be positive, or to be a positive object of the mind. Krause here thinks of something like phenomenology or philosophical reflections on givenness as such. Since the Absolute is the original unity of its features, however, it follows that the Absolute also is the unity of wholeness and positivity. Corresponding to this unity of wholeness and positivity, there is consequently another science where the universe of discourse is determined by the category of the positivity of wholes, which might be referred to as Gestalt psychology. Let us turn to the relation between God and the world. Before Krause specifies this relation, he introduces a division between two distinct modes of conceiving any kind of object. We can consider an object as such, and we can consider it in itself. To consider an object as such means to consider it as a whole, and insofar as it is a whole, without recurrence to its internal constitution or parts. To consider an object in itself is to consider it as regards its internal constitution or parts and how they relate to the whole they constitute. To deploy a modern example, if we consider water as such, then we consider water insofar as it is distinguished from the molecules of which it is constituted. Water as such is wet, fills the rivers and oceans around us, can freeze, etc. Water in itself is constituted of H2O molecules, none of which as such has any of the properties of water as such. Water, insofar as it is a whole, is distinguished from its parts, although it is not independent from its parts. The distinction between as such and in itself brings to mind the modern concept of emergence and applies to anything on any level of constitution. It also applies to the absolute, that is, to the one infinite principle of being and recognition. Depending on how we conceive of the absolute, we either obtain the conclusion that everything is in the absolute, or that the absolute is outside of the world. In this respect, Krause's theory of the relation between God and world puts us in mind of the fact that how we interpret things depends on how we understand them, whether as such or in themselves, while the things do not themselves change. Let us start with conceiving of the absolute as such. Conceived of in this way, it is impossible that there is something outside of, or next to, or in addition to it, since, as the one principle, it is the ground of everything. There could be something outside of the principle, if and only if the one principle as such would not be the ground of everything. However, if nothing can be outside of God as such, then the world has to be in God as such. Whereas Krause is aware that the use of these common language prepositions is problematic when it comes to philosophy. I quote, "Of course, in our ordinary language, all words which denote relations between things are based on spatial connotations like in, outside of, in addition to, above, below, next to. But all these words have to be spiritualized and have to be understood in a way independent from the senses if they are used in philosophy. Therefore, we may not twist the philosopher's words as if he is speaking about spatial relations. Particularly, we may not do so when he speaks about the infinite and the finite." End of quote. Krause deploys the following definition of in. Quote, "I deploy in respect of finite beings and their properties in such a way that the whole has this finite entity as its part, such that this finite entity is the same as the whole as regards its categories, while it is limited in the following way. The limitation of the finite entity is the same as that of the whole, whereas this limitation does not limit the whole as a whole." End of quote. For example, the sun is in the universe. Since the spatial limitation of the universe is at once a spatial limitation of the sun, they share in the same spatial categories, although the precise spatial limitation of the sun is not the spatial boundary of the universe. Consequently, that everything is in the one principle means that everything shares its categorical essence with the categories that have their purest form in the original unity of the one principle, in such a way that no single finite entity actually is a limitation of the principle as such. Everything is in God as such, because everything is what it is only through participation in the original unity of the Absolute. However, considered in itself, there is a distinction between the Absolute and the world, a distinction which is reminiscent of the distinction between a whole, insofar as it is a whole, and its internal constitution or parts. Insofar as a whole is not identical to its parts and not reducible to any of its parts, it is distinguishable from its internal constitution. Krause calls God insofar as God is distinguished from what he is principle of, Urwesen, and insofar as we consider the whole together with its internal constitution, that is, insofar as we consider the essential unity between the principle and what it is principle of, Orwesen.
Urwesen,
So,
original essence.
So
Wesen.
Urwesen is the absolute insofar as it is distinguished from what it is principle of, and insofar as we think about the absolute as such, Krause calls it Orwesen.
I know about Ur, it means origin or source. What's Or? What is that in German? What is that in English?
That's an interesting question, because that is part of the syllable Or is part of Krause's own.
He's made it up.
He made it up. I mean, he says at some point. He says at some point that it reminds of the Sanskrit or the Hindu term of Om, which indicates in the pure. That's. So, and if we conceive of God as Orwesen, then the world is internal to God, in the same way in which the parts are in the whole. And if we conceive of God as Urwesen, then God is outside of the world in the same way in which the whole is something over and above its parts. The distinction between Orwesen and Urwesen, according to Krause, answers the question, quote, of whether God is an extra-mundane and the world is an extra-divine being or not. Since through the distinction of Orwesen from himself as Urwesen, one can see that God, as the one identical whole essence, is neither out of, nor above, nor next to, nor in the world, and that God as Urwesen is outside of and above the world, and the world outside of him as Urwesen. End of quote. Given Krause's remark on science as a whole, and his dialectical stance on the relation between God and the world, he is able to draw the conclusion that panentheism is an adequate name for his system of philosophy. In Krause's words, quote, since in the intellectual intuition of God we find that Orwesen as the one, also in itself and through itself, below itself is everything, also everything finite, we have to assert that the one in itself and through itself is the all. And since in the intuition of God we recognize that God is everything in himself, below himself, and through himself, it would not be false to call science panentheism. End of quote. There is a fundamental objection against Krause's philosophy. Krause anticipated it and formulates it thus, quote, you will object that my philosophy is circular. I know this. It is on purpose and cannot be any different. The circle itself is the following. In order to start with philosophy, you have to have the belief that the whole world is harmonic. And once you are done philosophizing, you come back to where you started. But most importantly, we have to notice that that which is true is that without which humans cannot be. If this is the case, then the truth has to be abdicated in every human, even in the most uneducated ones, even if in a very peculiar manner, since without truth nobody can live. Therefore, it is no surprise that at the beginning of philosophy we do not doubt what at philosophy's end we only know much deeper and better. End of quote. The rationale behind this objection is that Krause's panentheism is circular from the very beginning, since he starts with a particular conception of science and truth, which analytically entails that there has to be the one principle of being and recognition. Furthermore, given his definition of in, it comes as no surprise, but is an analytic entailment that everything is what it is in and through the one principle. One might say that Krause defined his terms in such a way that the results cannot fail to entail the kind of pantheistic system he explicated. However, if there is any force behind this objection, then it is an objection against any system of philosophy that is based on intuitions. Since arguably any system of philosophy is based on intuitions, this objection seems to me to be quite powerless. It is true, Krause elaborated a system of philosophy that is based on his intuition that being and recognition belong together and are intelligible if and only if they can be related to an ultimate and first infinite principle of being and recognition. It is also true that he tried to make this consistent given his definition of in, and that therefore it is to a certain extent circular. However, this circularity does not seem to be vicious, but is instead part of any holistic understanding of reality, the aim of which is to understand the whole of being and its internal constitution. The importance of Krause's panentheism. Of course, the above can only provide a glimpse of Krause's panentheistic system of philosophy, which he elaborated in several of his books and articles. However, it should be enough to see in which ways Krause's philosophy might provide interesting stimuli for recent discussions in philosophy. Firstly, Krause's panentheism can be connected with recent debates in the philosophy of religion, where philosophers and theologians like Whitehead, Hartshorne, and Clayton discuss panentheism as an alternative to classical theism. Now, as such, panentheism attempts to steer a middle course between an acosmic theism, which separates God and the world, and a pantheism, which identifies God with the universe as a whole. Positively speaking, panentheists want to balance divine transcendence and immanence by preserving aspects of the former's claim of God's self-identity, while embracing the latter's intimacy between God and universe. The most serious problem for panentheism today is to find a fitting interpretation of the preposition in. As Gregersen argues, the little word in is the hinge of it all. Apart from the spatial interpretation, which Krause was right to exclude, the following interpretations of in have been discussed recently. I quote, "The world is in God because God energizes the world, God experiences or apprehends the world, God ensouls the world, God plays with the world, God enfields the world, God gives space to the world, God binds up the world by giving the divine self to the world, God provides the ground of emergences in or the emergence of the world, and God graces the world." End of quote. Krause's categorical interpretation of in is not included in the list and offers an important addition. According to Krause, the world is in God since everything is what it is, only by way of categorical participation in the original union of the Absolute, whereas the Absolute as the first principle is not reducible to anything it is the principle of. Further discussion could improve and refine Krause's interpretation of in. Secondly, Krause's distinction between conceiving an entity as such and in itself could help to clarify God's relation to the world. As we saw above, Krause argued for the following. Conceived of as Orewesen, God is the one truly infinite and unbounded first ground of everything, outside of which and independent of which nothing can be. Conceived of in itself, however, God can be distinguished from the world as Urewesen, analogously to the way in which a whole as a whole can be distinguished from its parts and is more than its parts. This distinction between Orewesen and Urewesen arguably is a predecessor of Hartshorne's dipolar conception of God, according to which God is both the universal cause of reality, Krauses Urwesen, and the all-inclusive reality itself, Krauses Orwesen. Thirdly, the distinction between considering an entity in itself and considering it as such can also be deployed in order to conceptualize the various systematic interrelations between entities and systems of entities discussed in the sciences. As Edward 2004 says, quote, "When science looks at anything at all, whether it be a proton, a galaxy, a cell, or the most complex thing we know, the human brain, it finds systems of relationships. Every entity seems to be constituted by at least two fundamental sets of relationships. First, there are the interrelationships between the components that make up an entity. Thus, a carbon atom is constituted from subatomic particles. Secondly, there is the relationship between the entity and its wider environment. End of quote. In Krause's terminology, we can state this as follows. Insofar as we consider the components that make up an entity, we consider the entity in itself, and insofar as the entity in question is part of a wider environment, we consider it as such. Since the distinction between considering an entity in itself and as such applies at any level of ontological constitution, it follows that the resulting model of intra- and inter-level relationships between entities and systems of entities is a holistic one. For instance, we can consider a human being as such and in itself. If we consider it as such, then we consider it as a self-directed, whole and unified entity, which is part of a larger whole, for instance, humanity. If we consider it in itself, then we consider it, for instance, insofar as it is constituted by billions of atoms. We could then go on to consider humanity as such and in itself, and the atoms as such and in itself, and so forth, in order to obtain a holistic system of systems structured by the relations of as suchness and in itselfness. Krause's panentheistic ethics. The insights obtained in Krause's theoretical philosophy about the nature of God as the all-including reality that incorporates everything in itself have a direct impact on every further finding of mankind, as well as on the particular question of how to act in a morally right way. I quote from Krause, "To understand what follows from the recognition of God as the principle of being is the only aim of scientific education. It is the development of all knowledge originating in the intellectual intuition of God, the one idea, the infinite, unconditional essence, unfolding in the finite spirit a space of scientific thought, so that just as everything is and lives in the one, all knowledge is found and lives in the intuition of God." End of quote. Now, ethics is the science concerning what to do and how to act. It gives us normative commandments as to how we should govern our thinking, willing, and acting in such a way that it is morally good thinking, willing, and acting. Since we have already seen that the essence of every entity is contained in the eternal nature of the Absolute, and since, according to Krause, temporality is an essential part of the world in which we live, Krause concludes that, first of all, it is the natural tendency of all creatures, whether alive or not, to realize in time their own essence that is yet already fixed by and recognized as a part of God's infinite essence. In other words, since the very essence of each creature is enshrined forever in God, it is the goal of the history of the world to realize this idea in time in order to, eventually, realize the Absolute itself in history. As Krause says, quote, "History is the one life of God." End of quote. The first ethical commandment, therefore, is directly based on the intuition of the essence of God. I quote, "Which is the first commandment? The first commandment is, Thou shalt embrace God in your primal essence according to your own peculiar way. So, to know, love, want, and be sacred to God's essence, which is the highest good, means to create good in life, because God exists above and in all individuals, He who incorporates and holds all creatures in Himself. Those who strive to know God in such a way, to love and to hold Him sacred, also will respect all finite beings, themselves not excluded, because they are all similar to God in and through God Himself." End of quote. From the knowledge of God and the recognition of the truth of panentheism, therefore, grows the realization that each individual creature, whether alive or not, deserves respect, love, and help in order to achieve and perfect the realization of their essence and purpose, because, ultimately, each of these creatures is a part of God Himself, that is, a part of His very own infinite essence. Therefore, we should act so that, quote, humanity, reason and nature, and all that is in them and lives and happens in the presence of God, is treated actually as a part of God himself, end of quote. In regards to humanity as such, Krause derives the following ethical commandment. I quote, "What is the one commandment of humanity? That mankind becomes fully human, that it realizes its whole eternal essence in time, in other words, that it fulfills its eternal essence, that humanity is accomplished like one undivided and united being, in respect to the inner and outer life in body and spirit of all men and women, children, adults and old people, all individual people and all societies, all families, friends, free societies, villages, tribes and nations, and that all those people live in good harmony, united with nature and reason, and thus supremely united with God." End of quote. Every single person, therefore, has a duty and obligation to help other people unconditionally and regardless of their physical or mental condition, and to respect and love them. Since man, as a corporeal being, is a part of the whole harmonious nature, a particular ethical requirement in relation to the natural environment around us arises as well, namely, to honor every being in nature, to love and respect them, regardless of whether it is a living being or an inanimate object. I quote, "Thou shalt recognize all beings, respect, love, and hold them sacred, because all of them surround you and are equal to you in and through the essence of God. Every little thing in its own way and in concord with all beings is well and good. All beings proclaim God and his eternal love." End of quote. If each and every one of us tries in his best knowledge, intent and belief to obey these commandments and to realize them in act and will, then, according to Krause, a state will be reached where perfect mankind reigns on earth. In other words, the aim of Krause's panentheistic ethics is to reach a state in which, quote, "the self and the society create a harmonious one, reflecting the idea of God. A state of mankind that is a matched, healthy, powerful and beautiful whole, realized through purification, formation and perfection of mankind, so that every person and every human society, existing within and because of the unity of nature and reason, lives for themselves and in compassion for others, and that they give themselves to the goodness, freedom, guidance, education, and perfection of the whole of being, so that finally all individuals in humanity achieve maturity, that there will be no more condescending, but instead everyone will be connected with everything, and everyone will exist in a divine freedom and represent the very image of the Absolute in absolute harmony." End of quote. Summary. There is hardly a philosophical system that in the end does not intend to provide humanity with ethical guidelines based on a theoretical analysis of the essence of things and the nature of man and his position in the universe. Krause's system of philosophy is no exception. Driven by the desire to obtain immediately certain knowledge of what should be done from an ethical point of view, Krause developed a complex system of philosophy whose sole object is the absolute and its relation to every finite creature. Based on the recognition of God and the conclusion that God is the one infinite being that holds everything within, Krause is not only able to develop a sustainable philosophy of science that justifies a holistic approach to science as a whole, but is also able to justify a particular panentheistic ethics according to which every existing entity has an absolute and non-negotiable intrinsic moral value that directly derives from its participation in the absolute. This ethics not only is able to explain that every human person has the right to develop in the best way possible, but also has the argumentative resources to show that nature in particular has an intrinsic moral value that human beings have to respect. Furthermore, since God is in every entity and every entity is in God, it follows that compassion towards every creature is a central ethical obligation, because it is the utmost expression of the recognition of the divine nature of all of reality. Thank you very much.